I'm lucky to take the role of our president, Ray Young. My name is Dr. Dale F. Simpson Jr. I'm a board member of the IAAA. I'm also an archaeologist with the Illinois State Archaeological Survey. I would just briefly, before I introduce our speaker today, I just wanted to talk a little bit about our association. Excuse me, I'm just going to share the screen for those that need to see our webpage. I was honored to, during my PhD, Bob had asked me to give a member's speech about my work that I was doing on Easter Island. And it was my first introduction to the CAS. And I was really honored that he had selected me. And as I went through the webpage and understanding how the Chicago Archaeological Society sits in its parent organization of the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology, I was, I was quite sad I wasn't aware of this group earlier. One thing that I've noticed is we need to have a push of bringing some fresh blood into our associations. And it was great that he allowed me to come in and give a talk. Our group has 2 program schedules. You can find most of it on our webpage. You can see it under our events where we have a lecture series. We also have events over the summer to different museums or watching certain videos about trips that members of the Chicago Archaeological CAS had taken in the past. But I think it's a great group. There are multiple chapters within the IAAA. We are just one of them. And once you become a member, you'll receive the quarterly, which is Illinois Antiquity. I want to show the audience so they can see what they would get. Let's go here. Oh, not that one. Let's go here. Okay. So we get this quarterly, which really we've done some upgrades in the last 2 years. And as I'm the editor of this, I really try to get a variety of both pre-contact archaeology and also sort of post-contact archaeology. And it's a good way to see what's happening in our state. There are other states that look up to this sort of quarterly. We're now in 59 years of it being produced. Next year will be our 60th anniversary. And then you also, part of your membership, you receive Rediscovery, which was just published. And this is about every 3 or 4 years or so. And you have a chance to have access to what's happening in our state's archaeology. But what's cool about the CAS is while a lot of other groups focus on mostly Illinois and Midwestern archaeology, what we do is we focus on global archaeology. And I think that's our call. And we've had a variety of speakers, as you can see on our list, that range everything from New World archaeology, Old World, Mesoamerican. It's quite a mix. But for today, I think we are in for a treat because we both know that Deb and Bob, they were very much interested in Mesoamerican archaeology. And I think our speaker today, Lucy, has done a great job, our sort of programs manager, to bring together a variety of speakers. And today I have the real pleasure of listening to someone I have learned about through my research on Rapa Nui. We know Easter Island is also pigeonholed with this ideal of collapse, that the island cut down all their trees and killed themselves and ate themselves, and the culture is no longer. And we've seen a great pushback by archaeologists and anthropologists to really say, are those models correct? Are they actually valid to describe how a culture is? Do cultures really collapse? So I'm really excited to learn in another context about a Mayan sort of excavations and projects from Dr. Ann Pyburn. Is that correct? At the moment, she's living life. She's on sabbatical, which is great. But Dr. Pyburn has her BA from Reed College in Portland, and then she got smart and went warmer and got her MA and PhD from the University of Arizona in Tucson. So I think that that was a good move. She's really an anthropological archaeologist, meaning she practices sort of a four-fielded approach. She has done work mostly in Mesoamerica, and Belize will be her hot topic today, but she's also done work in Central Asia, which I find interesting. Most of the archaeologists I know that have multiple areas they work on, it helps them better understand the archaeological record because they're able to tap into different places and seeing what's happening there. So beyond collapse, she also works with a lot of local high schools and education groups trying to bring in archaeology, anthropology, science-based work into more local educations. And I'll just leave you with this. I think one of the best books that I remember reading was her Collision or Collaboration. It was with her and Peter Gold in 2016. And it just really talks about what archaeology can do to, we may not be those that are going to say how the future is happening, but we have a lot of knowledge about what we know in the past. And the mistakes that people made in the past, we can avoid them by knowing better. And as I always say, the best thing you can do in the present for the future is learn about the past. And I think our speaker today will do a great job telling that. So please give a warm applause to Dr. B coming on up. I'm just going to get your, oh, okay, I know that one there. Let's go here. I think shared. Good to go there. Okay, and you've got your clicker there if you need it, or your laptop. Thank you.
So before I get started, I need to point out that there will be images of human remains in this presentation. Some people are uncomfortable with that, so it's fair to warn you. Wherever we are, today, if we're in the Americas, we're on land that was occupied at the time Columbus showed up. Well, it's important to acknowledge that in order to begin to think about what it means. Just acknowledging it runs a risk of becoming performative. If you're concerned about human rights, the human rights of Indigenous people, there's a QR code scattered through my PowerPoint that you can use if you want to take constructive action. In 1989, I discovered the remains of an ancient settlement in the Belizean jungle. That was unknown to science, but National Geographic would have happily announced as the discovery of a lost city. I didn't announce it because my primary concern was to protect it from looters. Okay.
Well, they won't anymore. You are invisible.
Okay. Okay, so I didn't announce it because it was a pristine site. There had been almost no looting, and I didn't call attention to its location. The way that I was introduced to the site is a good story, but it's not really the story I want to tell today. Still, briefly, I found it because the local people took me to it, and I researched it because the local people asked me to do it. Before LiDAR, that new aerial technology that sees through trees, most jungle cities were already known to local people. Sometimes lucky archaeologists would stumble on the larger sites, but rarely did local people seek out archaeologists to share their secrets. Over the next 20 years, I spent 7 field seasons running field schools and training grad students and promoting education and tourism in the village of Crooked Tree. I think I made some important discoveries about life in Belize before the Americas were devastated by European disease, enslavement, and ignorance. But I also began to see how the culture of my discipline, meaning the language, traditions, and social hierarchies of archaeology, were restricting our ability to understand the past. So here's a reconstruction drawing of the structure 1 in the site center and a photo of one of the early excavations of its staircase. The site's now known as Chowhish. It was locally known as Indian Hill, as are many sites in Belize. But the villagers who asked me to work there asked me to come up with a Mayan name because they wanted to convince tourists to visit. So we settled on the Kekchi word for jaguarundi, since one visited us the first time we walked across the site. That's a jaguarundi. It's a small, wild jungle cat. So what did I discover at Chowhish? I found some pretty things. I opened 3 royal tombs, one that included the ancestral bones of 12 different ancestors, pearls, turquoise, some fabulous jade earrings, one with a pile of eccentric flints, obsidian cores, and more beautiful jade jewelry, and one with pyrite earrings and spondula shells. I also figured out the psychological impact of an elevated, paved, and painted central platform. After several seasons of struggling to cope with the wet mud of northern Belize, which is not confined to the rainy season, I realized that stepping onto a vermin-free, dry, open space that was painted, mostly red, was like stepping into a controlled and protected arena that surely inspired respect and acceptance of a political authority. I learned this when I finally allowed my own personal experience to seep into my understanding of the past, when I stopped insisting that everything about the past must have been different. I also learned that the inhabitants had created an enormous hydrological system that would have allowed them to grow at least 3 crops of corn per year, an astonishing feat in a tropical ecosystem with no chemical fertilizer and no pesticides. I figured this out with a combination of observation and the local knowledge of farmers and ranchers who could see artificial landforms that I couldn't. When I finally did see these canals and dams, I was afraid to publish them because they were so massive. They were so unbelievably massive, I thought nobody would believe in me. I finally did publish them. And a couple of years ago, a junior colleague restudied them and expanded the area of them to 3 times the size of what I originally could. So you see where I'm going with this. Respect for local empirical knowledge clued me in, and acknowledging the relevance of personal experience woke me up. When we exoticize the past and insist that ancient people were very different, sometimes we miss the obvious. My most important discovery was derived from 4 seemingly unrelated and not particularly glamorous pieces of evidence. First, in the central platform of the site of Chowhish, I found the remains of a huge party that was thrown in the 10th century or thereabouts. That's my former graduate student, Sarah Willey. There was a hurricane that knocked over a tree, and the tree pulled up the surface of the ground on the central platform and exposed a layer of artifacts. It's a huge layer of smashed artifacts, mostly pottery, but lithics and jade, jaguar teeth, all kinds of amazing stuff. Just a solid layer of the remains of some people having an extremely good time. Second, on the back of the main platform, I found the remains of a bricked up 10th century palace. And there you can see my former graduate student, Christopher Andrus, Kip Andrus, with some assistants. You can see the wall that he's exposing here. This is fill. This was put inside the building to fill it up, to brick it up. This was a hearth, of some kind of hearth, some kind of very special feature from something that was done right before the building was filled up with rocks, so that it was obviously no longer used, at least not in the way it had been. Then I found a lot of offerings from the 12th century on the ground surface. At the base of structure 1, people were on the site after the palaces were no longer occupied. And, and I found, or rather my physical anthropology graduate student Gabe Roble found, the burial of 2 men who were possibly Spaniards, but certainly Christians. They had metal rings on their left ring fingers. They were buried supine, unlike most of the burials on the site, and clearly conquest period. The metal, he got the metal of the staining on the bones of their ring fingers tested, and it contained lead, which was necessarily a European origin. So to understand what I had found, I had to rethink the concept of the Maya collapse. So let's talk about the Maya collapse. I want to make 3 points about the Maya collapse. First of all, we don't really know as much about it as you might think from the media coverage of what archaeologists say to newspaper reporters. Second, it's important to be really clear about which Maya we're talking about collapsing. And third, that science is not independent of the culture of the scientist who practices it. Even if you know this, sometimes our understanding of the world is more biased than we realize. What did I do? Should I just tell that to go away? Okay. Research doesn't begin in science, it begins in the culture of science and in the culture of the scientist. So before I go any further, here we go. I want to make it clear that I am a scientist. I'm committed to empirical verification and testing hypotheses. In this talk, I'm going to challenge some hypotheses that I don't think have been properly tested and undermine some ideas about ancient peoples that most people, including archaeologists, consider to be factual. But there has been a revolution in archaeology, and I am one of its guerrilla warriors. Archaeology is more than entertainment. It's more than lessons from the past, and more than a verification of things we think we already know about human nature. But the key to unlocking the power of archaeology is learning to respect indigenous and ancient knowledge systems, not as other ways of knowing, but as other kinds of science. To allow for the possibility, in fact, I think the likelihood that in many important ways, ancient peoples were creative, philosophical, politically astute, and in fact, exactly like us. So point number 1, as a result of the constant stream of media releases and television specials focused on the Maya collapse, many people don't realize that there are 10 million Maya speakers alive today, living as they always have in cities and in towns, farming the jungle lowlands of Belize and Mexico and Honduras, and Guatemala and the dry karst landscapes of Yucatan and the cool highlands of Chiapas. This is not to say that things haven't changed, but to point out that there is a degree of sustainability that people almost never recognize. Point number 2, as for who we're talking about, the word Maya refers to people who speak about 30 languages, that's according to Matthew Resdahl, and whose cultures are related, but not at all uniform, either now or in the past. In fact, the term Maya is a colonial word for people who didn't consider themselves related, much less the same. 40 years ago, the Kekchi did not know that they were Maya. They thought that they were Kekchi. My third point is that our decision to explain changes in the archaeological record of Mesoamerica as a collapse has caused us to miss some interesting and important facts about Mayan history, and to exaggerate particular data points that we think speak to our contemporary concerns. Though these arguments may seem superficially politically correct, it's possible that there's something more complicated, but more accurate and more important to learn from Maya history. So who were the Maya, and what do we mean when we say their civilization collapsed? can't believe I'm giving this talk to Dr. Miller. I'm really embarrassed to be summarizing my accomplishments to one of the world's experts in the room. The first artifacts that are recognizable to us as Maya were made at 1100 BC, scattered across the area I showed in that earlier map. This means that people speaking 30 languages have been living across 120,000 square miles of territory for 3,000 years. A lot has happened in that amount of space and time, and there's more than one story to be told. You're probably familiar with some of the accomplishments of these peoples. I don't have time to give you many details, but they developed a calendar that was more accurate than the European calendar at the time. You may have heard that the Maya considered time to be cyclical. Well, so do we. Our calendar repeats weekdays and months, and we keep track of events to use the knowledge of the past to try to predict the future, which is exactly what the Maya were doing. Our greatest historians have claimed that history repeats itself, which is why the Maya watched the stars. Our politicians have also depended on astrology. You may not remember, but Ronald Reagan consulted an astrologer. And in addition to the short count, which repeated dates at shorter intervals, the classic Maya also used the long count that gave them absolute dates, just like the Gregorian calendar. Maya astronomers could predict eclipses accurately, but they couldn't always predict whether they would be visible. Sometimes the eclipses they predicted were in Australia, but they wouldn't know it. Many of the surviving glyphs are really about this, but that's another lecture. Maya peoples shared a writing system that was probably originated by the Olmec. Maya writing is syllabic, like Chinese. There are several hundred characters. Each stands for a different syllable. Writing, especially on monuments, was probably a lingua franca, meaning because many of the major Maya languages are related, having a similar grammar would make it possible to follow the syntax of a text no matter which languages you spoke. And as I mentioned, it was probably common for people to speak more than one language. I believe Americans are the only people who don't speak more than one language. Decipherment, of course, is an exciting story. That's another lecture. The Maya had sophisticated mathematics with a concept and a notational system that includes zero, which is a big deal if you need to make complex calculations. If you don't believe me, try dividing a very large number with the Roman numerals. The complexity of their hydrology and architecture demonstrate a working knowledge of geometry. Of course, Maya cities are famous for their architecture. Until recently, we believed Maya architects only used a corbelled arch and not what we ethnocentrically call a true arch. But excavations by Payson Sheets at the site of El Serén in El Salvador, where the structures were preserved, like the structures at Pompeii by a volcanic eruption, discovered a dome structure made of wattle and daub that sticks in clay, which is another indication of their geometric knowledge. If you're interested in the Maya, you've probably read plenty about divine kings, but these political manifestations were not uniform across space and time. May not know that some Maya communities shared social, economic, and even political power much more evenly between men and women than anyone anticipated, and still do today. Most stela depict male rulers, but some cities had female rulers, especially later in time. In some depictions, male rulers wore female garments, and female rulers wore some male garments, suggesting that a good ruler should bring together male and female qualities. And not all cities were ruled by kings. At the time of the conquest, there were communities governed by a council of elders. Pre-conquest agricultural systems were and still are complex and varied. And Maya systems took advantage of microenvironmental variations and soil types, drainage patterns, and the climatic regimes of specific locations. New World agriculture didn't look much like European agriculture, and it has taken a great deal of time for us to begin to even see the unique strategies and managed landscapes that sustained huge populations. I'm going to return to this in a minute because our misunderstanding of subsistence strategies as food systems of many indigenous peoples has led us to underestimate the sustainability, not just of the Maya or Maya speakers, but of the peoples of California and the Northwest coast of the US, some of the Aboriginal cultures of Australia. I'm guessing probably I should include Papua New Guinea. So despite the immense amount that has been written about the Maya collapse, it's still pretty hard to determine exactly what collapsed in the 9th century in the Maya lowlands. All our data are negatives. We define the collapse in terms of what is missing that we think should be present in the archaeological record of a not collapsed civilization. Mainly the collapse is the time when stela, writing, and large monuments were mostly no longer being used. People also stopped making gorgeous polychrome pots like the one on the right. And they're pretty cool, but it's hard to see the lack of them as the end of civilization. The little post-classic polychrome diving god sensor on the other side of the slide is not as high RT, but it's not chocolate. We know writing didn't stop in the 9th century, since people could still write at the time of the conquest. We have some of their writing that was commissioned by the Spanish. So instead of the end of written language, there seems to have been a change in the way writing was used, and a change in how well-written documents survived for us to find, especially since the Spanish friar Diego de Landa burned all the flammable documents he could get his hands on. The older documents we have are mostly carved on stela, great big rocks that are hard to eradicate, and I would say are probably more likely to carry a certain kind of message. So there was still monumental buildings, but smaller, almost no stela, but still writing, and polychrome pots that were somewhat less fancy. Continuing the story, the populations of some large urban centers declined dramatically in the 9th century, except that the sudden depopulation took 100 years in some cases, 100 years or so, and sometimes actually it occurred in the 4th century or the 5th or the 7th, and sometimes people came back. In fact, different communities followed quite distinct historical trajectories. Oops, now I've broken it. Sorry, can't take me anywhere. We know people stopped constructing a certain type of monumental center and seem to have begun to use the abandoned downtown areas differently. What this means is that habitation is harder for archaeologists to see, but it doesn't mean that everybody was gone. In the past few years, LiDAR images of the Maya lowlands that can penetrate vegetation and cloud cover have quadrupled the size of the population estimates for many settlement areas. Very little of these new data have been ground truthed, that is, have been dated. But many Maya who disappeared have probably now reappeared. Dating will clarify this situation, but already the desertion of monumental centers begins to look very different from the previous picture. We know palaces were abandoned because they're easy to find archaeologically. Even after 1,000 years, the pile of stones is still there. But little dirt-floored houses could be occupied for hundreds of years and leave almost no archaeological trace. Even LiDAR only picks up structures built on mounds, and not all Maya houses were elevated. Actually, there were plenty of post-classic Maya cities, and many were thriving at the time of the Spanish arrival. There are only a few of them, actually, on this map. This is Tulum, was the first New World city seen by Cortez. It was occupied well into the 16th century, long after the collapse. And post-classic cities like Chunchulfmil were often very densely populated. This post-classic city in Mexico has little monumental architecture, but it has a very large and dense settlement pattern of the area. Scott Hudson, the principal investigator of the site, has found hieroglyphic evidence that the ancient settlement had the same name as the existing community in the area, proving cultural continuity from before the conquest into the present. So now that we've reviewed the somewhat sketchy data on the Maya collapse, let's turn to the explanations. Our extensive missing evidence does not support any of the obvious possibilities. We don't see evidence of disease. When plague swept through Europe, some people always survived. And when people die of plague, what part of the population goes first? Not the elites, but that's clearly the part of the Maya world that seems to have collapsed, since we know palaces and elite households houses were abandoned. Some populations have gotten large enough to strain their food, may have gotten large enough to strain their food supply. For example, David Webster believes there were food shortages at Copan. We have no idea what percentage of any population was malnourished, but it would be shocking if there were never food shortages for 3,000 years over an area of 120,000 square miles. When starvation decimates populations, the elites survive, and the survivors don't leave. In Europe, where early overpopulation is documented, people suffer and struggle and figure out ways to accommodate themselves to shortages. This is where it's important to remember that by the 9th century, the Maya had succeeded for 2,000 years to match their population to their food production. Despite the emphasis of scholars on Maya violence, hard evidence for warfare is surprisingly thin. Arthur Demarest has evidence from the Patech-Batun region of Guatemala that serious raiding was endemic, and in fact, some cities in this region were depopulated as early as the 6th century. But warfare on a small scale is hard to find archaeologically. We don't have mass burials. We don't have very many burnt buildings. It's hard to believe that killing thousands of people with clubs and wooden swords wouldn't leave evidence. More to the point, empty land is not what conquerors want. They want tribute and goods and food, and they want to move their own people into the area, and we don't see this. We just see deserted centers. If warfare was endemic, people who live in a nucleated settlement under the control of a divine king are easily subject to takeovers that increase their taxes. In fact, Maya warfare, as we know it, as documented, was aimed at taking captives, especially elites and soldiers, rather than exterminating enemies. Evidence for Maya violence from iconography and elite-focused hieroglyphics is hard to evaluate. You wouldn't count the crucifixes in Evanston, Illinois, to find out how frequently your neighbors practice crucifixion. You wouldn't believe Vladimir Putin's claims about the conquest of Ukraine. This illustration from the murals of Bonaparte shows a very specific historical event with named victims. Did this sort of thing happen all the time, or was it commemorated because it was a rare event of a political execution or capital punishment of a crime? Some images were exaggerated to frighten the neighboring community. Some were allegorical. There's a famous one that turns out to be a sacrifice of a tree that symbolizes seasonal change. And we don't know how many different representations actually reference the same event. The gold cross on the neck of a high school cheerleader looks pretty different from a Russian icon, but the two reference the same event. Both the ancient Maya and modern archaeologists have exaggerated the Maya propensity to violence. Then there's the environmental degradation story. It's the fault of the farmers stupidly slashing and burning themselves to extinction. Here are the common assumptions about slash and burn agriculture that most people have heard. It's unsustainable, it caused the collapse, it can't produce a surplus, all of Maya were doing it. It's the same everywhere, the jungle is uniform. But slash and burn agriculture is sustainable and can produce a surplus, but you have to know your environment very intimately. Many Maya towns and villages were occupied for well over 2,000 years, plenty of time to get to know your environment. Clearly, their subsistence system worked just fine. And there are many other types of Maya agriculture. The Spanish mostly saw people practicing slash and burn in primary forests. If you're driven from your home and escaping into the jungle from the Spanish, into unknown microenvironments and have no time to develop proper fields, you slash and burn. If your workforce is devastated by disease and conquest, slash and burn in primary forest is expedient. Remember, at least 80%, and some scholars now claim 90% of Maya people died at the conquest. Many of the ancient strategies that required a coordinated workforce have died out and are only known from archaeological reconstructions. But now that we know what to look for, we are finding agricultural terraces and other kinds of land modifications everywhere. That disgraceful looking pile of rocks is actually what remains of a terrace from about the 7th century on Albion Island. By far the most exciting discovery about the Maya has been raised fields, in my opinion. They're amazing. They provide transport, fertilizer, and pest control, plus aquaculture. This is a technique for farming the swamps that Maya were using in many parts of, many different communities were using. Raised fields, ridge fields, island fields. There are many variations that were geared to take advantage of particular microenvironments. A typical raised field is created in a swamp. Canals are dug in the swamp. The mud from the canals is used to build up the surface of the field with very fertile soil. The canals are used to transport crops, transport harvest. The canals were also used to grow fish, to grow snails. After the crops were harvested, you can flood the fields and allow water to stand on the fields for long enough for the larvae of the things that eat your crop to drown, to die. Then you drain the water again and you muck out the canals to replenish the surface of the fields with that nice muck that's now all full of fish poop and snail poop, which is exactly what corn, beans, and squash need to thrive. So then you grow your second crop. No doubt you've heard that Maya civilization collapsed because of drought. But the places that were abandoned do not conform to the places where drought would hit the hardest. Several sites in southern Belize were abandoned, such as Nimli Punit, which has an average rainfall of over 180 inches. It seems to me that a drought would be a great relief, but residents abandoned the site center and start carving stela. This is an image of the main structure at Chowhish before we did any clearing. And you can see that the vegetation from the heavy rainfall in the area has covered 70-meter tall structure in trees, but not completely obliterated it. Weirdly, sites in the Yucatan grew after the 9th century, suggesting that some population moved northward into the driest area of Mesoamerica where there is no surface water. So drought caused people to move from the wettest places to the driest. Really? Warfare, drought, overpopulation, these all occur in the history of any long-lived peoples. The focus of academics on one or the other of these causes has as much to do with modern political preoccupations as to the scientific recovery of new data. There are many other ways to interpret these same data. This is a graph from a study done by Richard Wilk in 1980, who counted the number of publications attributing the Maya collapse to a particular cause over time. He found the number of papers published attributing the collapse to environmental degradation peaked on Earth Day, that those attributed it to war peaked around the time of the first Vietnam moratorium, and the publication of Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, coincided with a rush of papers attributing the collapse to overpopulation. As I said, Rick did this study in the 80s. I leave it to you to decide whether current political context might encourage people to suggest that the Maya collapse was caused by drought. Population movements from one type of city to another that was more rationally organized and had fewer gigantic palaces. The reduction of time and effort spent on producing elite material culture, dishes and jewelry and warfare and weapons and stela bragging about the divinity of the king, suggests an important change, but not necessarily a bad one. When you think, whatever you think happened in the 9th century, the result seems to have been that the gap between rich and poor, between rulers and their subjects, got smaller. And it could be argued, and in fact it has been argued by Jerry Savloff and Bill Rathje in the 1970s, that the standard of living for ordinary people improved after the collapse. When communities decide over time, what if communities decided over time to change the way they lived? There's evidence of divine kings and their wars and alliances across many lowland sites where people spoke Maya languages, but these seem to rise and fall at different times. The cities have varied historical trajectories. It is true that by the end of the 9th century, certain types of material culture associated with elite power and excess seem to be much reduced or gone, but it happened sooner or later in different locations. One possibility is that much elite pomp and circumstance was about trade. Stable sedentary agricultural communities are a ready-made set of consumers, and elites who controlled and inspired the consumption of trade goods could have become quite powerful by moving stuff around and convincing people to buy it. This is something I noticed at Chowheesh. Ordinary people like to buy stuff. They had local church. They bought lots of it from a community that was 50 kilometers away. They bought obsidian from several hundred miles away. It even looks like they bought kinds of pottery that they could make themselves. So what did I find at Chowheesh? A big party where people celebrated something very dramatically at about the same time they bricked up a large palace. Evidence that people still used the site center, but not as a residence, as a place to lay offerings into the post-classic. And then 2 burials on the site from the early period of Spanish contact in the area. And by the way, these men were buried in a structure that was literally jammed with earlier burials. How did they know where the classic and post-classic elites were buried? Why were 2 men buried in a deserted site? Because it wasn't deserted, because they never left. Their populations are less visible to archaeologists because they were not participating in elite-focused trade and exotic goods, not carving steel or living in centralized palaces, and because European diseases ravaged the Mayaloans before the Spanish even appeared. Maybe they decided to be less visible to rapacious elites, or maybe they just began to live differently in a way that's less visible to us today. But this is a story about the triumphs and achievements of ordinary people, making intentional decisions about their political lives. In fact, it's a story about sustainability and the evolution of cultural strategies that became less archaeologically visible, but not less organizationally successful, or not even less complex. People in the past made mistakes, just as people in the present, and deserve credit and blame, just as do modern people, for greed and excess and miscalculation. But to look at the past with a jaundiced eye as only a source of cautionary tales about a past we don't want to be condemned to repeat is a focus on our fears and concerns about our own era, instead of reading our errors onto the past. I think there are some better lessons to learn. To fail to recognize historic Maya achievements cuts living Maya people off from pride in the accomplishments of their ancestors, and it undermines them politically. The government of Belize challenged the land rights of a group of Kekchi Maya living in southern Belize whose land use was characterized as primitive and unsustainable. How differently this decision would look if Kekchi people were seen as the descendants of brilliant political strategists and 3,000 years of sustainable agriculture. The Maya won their case in international court, but Belize is still trying to deny the Kekchi their rights to their land. This is an international precedent. Perhaps one day Maya people will have some say in how their history is told and how their heritage is used. The danger of these kinds of sweeping generalizations is that cherry-pick data to prove a point is that we underestimate the complexity of the past. Here is an alternative sweeping lesson from the past, no more highly generalized than those that are more familiar and based on the same data. Though the many stressors on Maya communities that archaeologists have identified may not apply as broadly as has been suggested, there probably were shortages of resources and environmental damage and increasing violence in some places at some times. Insofar as these increased toward the 9th century, when most evidence of despotic rulers disappears and large political centers were replaced by communities with less inequality in the distribution of resources, we might consider this evidence of Maya people's ability to address problems created when too much wealth and power is concentrated in the hands of a very few people who are answerable to no one. Wouldn't it be nice to know if this could happen? Many stories about the past justify the status quo by suggesting that violence, inequality, and human suffering are inescapable and a result of human nature. Instead, I think we might learn something useful from the past if we don't just ask questions that we think we already know the answer to. It seems to me also that archaeologists and their public are in need of some different lessons from the past and a spate of research on the success of ancient civilizations. Frankly, I think we have a lot to learn.
Watch. We'll start with some questions from the audience here. If you can speak loudly, and then will you just repeat the question into the microphone so the people at home could also hear? Thank you.
If I haven't talked you into submission. Yeah.
This is a very fine point question, it's not questioning your, not a question about the overall theme, but can you speak a little bit more about those individuals from that had the Spanish goods that were in that too? Were they themselves Mayan?
I'm pretty sure they were mine.
Okay.
Pretty sure they were mine. Yeah. The question is whether or not the Spanish period interments, their instructor to Chowhish were themselves ethnically Spanish and by heredity. And I'm pretty sure that they were Mayan heredity. It's only the existence or the style of the burial is what suggested to us that they were different. And the fact that their burials were cut through several thousand years of earlier burials. But the existence of the copper rings, which was something we had never seen before. The research that was discovered was made by Gabriel Roble, who's a bioarchaeologist. He's a professor at Michigan State, and he did the analysis of the copper that indicated that it had the origin.
Was there colonial activity?
Yes, yes, there was a colonial church at Lamini. And also Tipu is not that far.
How persistent is oral tradition of agriculture through time and how documented?
Well, okay. The question is about whether oral tradition carries memory of earlier types of agriculture. And I have to say that as far as I know, the oral traditions are pretty sketchy. Now, there's a lot of variation. I think there are some groups that have more localized oral traditions. There are some groups, like I suspect that the people of Tunchuchmil are practicing on a relatively dry substrate. This is a place where Scott Hudson has shown that the name of the community is the same as the community that he researched archaeologically. So I suspect that there is continuity of practice there. But in southern Belize, for example, the Kekchi were enslaved by a German chocolate baron who moved them to Guatemala for a few hundred years. So obviously there were people, not everyone left, but when those Mayan people came back, their continuity, their environmental knowledge seriously disrupted. So there's a lot of serious disruption. A lot of the problem, I think, is that the agricultural strategies like the humongous canals that I found in Chowhish, in order to use and maintain, they required a large amount of coordinated labor. And when your populations are decimated, kind of pushed away from your native territory where you've been for a few thousand years, that kind of knowledge it doesn't. The Spanish intentionally moved people into the kind of settlements that they wanted them to inhabit and disrupted social organization and cosmological systems in every way they could.
As archaeologists, what is a good example, or how would we go about piecing together those couple hundred years between the 9th century collapse and either fleet abandonment or the reoccupation of these sites? Because a lot of that, since it's on surface, it's the first to be moved to Hall and other places. So are there sites that would be a good laboratory for that, or how would we go and piece that together now?
how would we piece together figuring out what happened between the abandonment of city centers in some parts of my world and the present day? How would we go about finding that archaeologically, since land use patterns and cultural changes have eradicated a lot of the evidence? I'm hoping the easy answer, the hope is that the huge amount of new data that's been produced by LiDAR will come up with some archaeological sites that have not been as seriously disturbed. And that also archaeologists, when you're excavating a city, even a little town like Chavish probably never had 10 or 12,000 people. Nevertheless, they lived. That we have data from Chavish that dates to 1100. So we're talking 2,500 years of residence at the very least. That's a lot of stuff to dig up, and archaeologists really. It's really hard to convince archaeologists to dig in between visible buildings, to look for invisible buildings. It's really hard to convince archaeologists to screen their data because they have too many potsherds already. So it's going to take some changes and some different kinds of questions. Focusing on that question to begin with, I think, will make a significant difference.
Can you give maybe any kind of a specific example about how you're working in Belize versus some of the other Asian and some of the other portions of the world, bring things together in your mind? For example,
how can I? How is my work in Belize bringing ideas together about the Mayan world in a different way? I guess one of the things that I'm beginning to try to do is spend a lot more time talking to Maya speakers and listen a lot more carefully to what they have to say about the significance of their heritage. And in Belize, in fact, most parts of Mesoamerica, local people are sometimes included in archaeological conversations, but they don't ever get to ask questions. That's a new thing. And archaeologists, on a good day, have begun to talk about working with the Maya. Who really need to be working for the Maya? Most of us are not really in a position to be working with the Maya or considering hiring people to help us dig to be a collaboration. That's really not what that is. I will say that in about 1992, I wrote a grant proposal to the National Endowment for the Humanities, which was rejected. And one of the commentators wrote at the end of their rejection, and by the way, why is there this letter of invitation from the village? That's not science. And last year, the National Science Foundation began to require letters. So things are changing. One of the ways that archaeology is changing, one of the reasons that there is a revolution happening in archaeology, one of the ways that we are seeing things in the archaeological record that we didn't even know how to look for in the past, is that we're beginning to bring indigenous scholars into the discipline. We are getting past the idea that to be an authentic indigenous person, you have to have religion. Well, white people have science. That's so colonial. Indigenous people have science too. And I have 3,000 years of trial and error and experimentation and accumulated wisdom. So that's not an other way of knowing. That's a way of knowing. That's a regular way of knowing. And so as the tools of the master, which don't belong to the master, we've appropriated them, are now being shared back. That indigenous scholars all over the world are beginning to wield the tools of science to ask their own questions, where some of the things that are being discovered about managed landscapes and types of agriculture that we never imagined are just extremely exciting. And I anticipate some of this will be coming from Maya scholars. It's already beginning to, especially, well, yeah, sorry, I could, you pushed the wrong button. I could go on forever. Yeah.
Fascinating. It's hitting so many levels, some of the work I do as well. But what is the reaction of your performance, this ethnographic archaeology we've seen? What are the reactions of the Mayan when the outside world thinks that they've collapsed? What do they tell you about that?
I get so depressed. There's so many. How do Maya people think about being told that they collapsed? Maya people are not to be not to generalize too broadly, but I think most Maya and scholars would agree with this when I say that Maya people are astoundingly oppressed. And the idea that there might be another opinion that that their civilization didn't collapse. I mean, I just feel like they've been force-fed the Kool-Aid. When I gave a version of this talk to the Amarin Foundation, and it was a big online audience, several Maya people contacted me to ask me about the idea that Sweden agriculture, that slash and burn, is sustainable, because they had been taught in school that it's not sustainable, but it's just destructive. And it hurt my heart. So returning to my favorite subject, I think my concern now is to contribute as much as I can, the rest of the time I have, to promoting education for Maya people, for Maya young people, to offer them the chance to consider the repercussions of what is claimed about their past, and also the opportunity to ask some different and some questions about the past.
Real quick, can you discuss the QR code again? The QR code?
The QR code takes you to a contribution page for Tumokin, which is the Maya High School in Belize. So if you'd like to make a contribution to not just Tumokin, but to the Maya Educational Foundation, that would be a real contribution to Indigenous land rights. Yeah.
Have you, if I missed this, or you said this, I apologize. Have you written a book about this for the general public? And then reasonably educated person, but not an anthropologist, could understand with a lot of these illustrations. And if you haven't, are you going to?
I think my husband might be online. He's cheering you. Yeah, it's probably time. It's probably time for me to do it. When I gave the talk for the Amarin Foundation, the editor of Archaeology magazine sent me a very unpleasant email. He said, "Are you giving this talk again? Does anybody believe you?" I'm here to report that yes, there are people who believe me. But yes, it probably would be a good idea. So will you help me out? Could you follow? Could you follow it? Was it too convoluted?
I can hear what you don't always speak
into the microphone. Okay. Okay. Yeah. No,
I had one policy course in college Indiana University, Bloomington.
So you met Della Cook. Della Cook? Oh. Oh, oh,
About 18 and 19.
sorry, I missed him.
Yara,
Mm.
the long
Well, I have hooded, which is what you do when you give a PhD. Two of my hoods have been to Indigenous students, both one Navajo and one Lakota. So I'm very proud of that. I'm also working to provide scholarships for my students, both to get to high school and then to get to college. Yeah, I indoctrinate all my graduate students shamelessly. Well, I frequently manage to finagle some funding from the National Science Foundation grants, or yeah, I actually took money from FAMC to pay for a site guard. Right now I have a little bit of funding from a new program at Indy University that I'm going to use to begin a conversation among Maya speakers in Belize. No one has ever actually sat down with Maya speakers and said, what is your interest in archaeology? What do you think about it? What would you like to say to archaeologists about your heritage, about your ancestors? So that's a project that I'm just in the beginning of working on with Gabriel Bullet at Michigan State.
I think we'll take one more question.
You mean you're wondering why people think the Maya collapsed? Why any civilization? I mean, what would be the grand causes or the data? Well, I think we have an intellectual heritage in the West, the idea that civilizations rise and fall. So we kind of take that with us when we look at data. We expect to see evidence for a rise and a fall. So, for example, archaeologists talk about Maya chronology as pre-classic, classic, post-classic, late terminal, all these kind of in reference to a single timeline, a single trajectory. And what that does is that it amalgamates people who spoke 30 different languages and lived over 120 square miles of territory into a single chronology, as though they were all just one integrated thing. And obviously, it's possible to pick and choose around among there and pick out data that appear that fit your idea of rising and falling. But you can also look at it at a different way. So my point in this talk has been to encourage people to think about what model you're using to define collapse. What are you expecting that to look like? And then how are you reading your expectations onto a data set that's actually a lot more complicated? Does that help? Kind of? Yeah. Because really what our definition of collapse is that there's stuff missing. People stopped doing some stuff. They stopped building great big monuments. They stopped carving great big stela that advertised kings. They stopped making incredibly fancy, arty pottery. They made some nice stuff, but the kind that archaeologists and art dealers really like, they stopped making. And some of their enormous trade stopped, but then it kind of came back again. At any rate, any kind of change, if you're expecting a collapse, you say, oh, that led to the collapse, or that led to the rise. So it's kind of in the eye of the beholder, I think.
I was just going to make a comment. It's just really fun. And it bugged me so much because I've been here too much. So you have to discussion, but the quality of things that they have there was such high quality.
And so she's bothered by the fact that this seal of Lady Shock from Yaxchilan is in the British Museum and not in Yaxchilan.
That have the highest quality.
Right, that the British Museum has the goodies. And their excuse is that people come from everywhere to and learn about the Maya that wouldn't all go to Yaxchilan. But what are they learning about the Maya from having a piece of loot that's attributed to people whose civilization died? What is that teaching people about the Maya? That's maybe this is not really such a good excuse for having their stuff.
Well, I think they almost I was shocked when
Yes, well, they're holding on to the Elgin marble with their fingernails. Well, there's another issue that's even more problematic, and that is that repatriating stuff to a national government that oppresses the group whose ancestors made it is not necessarily a happy solution. That obviously doesn't apply to the Elgin marbles. But if that was repatriated, it's not going to go back to the mine. Well,
fluctuating them.
Everywhere.
One reminder that these lectures are on Facebook, and so that if you want to revisit this talk and sort of clarification, and now that we've heard it and seen things, probably within a day or so, it'll be on Facebook. And then to bring it a little bit local and not much discussion, I'm sort of out of the loop on it, but for Cahokia here, the central powers that kept the population building the structures and all that certainly disappeared, but the people were just moving out around the hinterland and other populations have been going on and things. The people really didn't disappear. It's just that the socio-political structure that held them together to do the architecture disappeared.
Yep. For the online people, and Wilson Dooley is just pointing out that at Cahokia, people didn't all fall over and disappear when the large administrative centers were no longer being used. And earlier than that, before that, she pointed out that for those of you who have insomnia, this lecture will be available on Facebook.
Okay, let's see if we'll give one more hand to our speaker, please. I think, yeah, okay, so that was just someone. Okay, so no questions, which is good. Okay, we'll take that one up. I will remind everyone that our next speaker is, let me just go to the webpage here, if you don't mind. Okay. Okay. We'll be giving updates on our webpage and on our social media feeds about yeah, okay, so we'll have our holiday luncheon. So no November, we're working on December. December 8th. So we would love to have more people in person here. Come on down to the Evanston Public Library. We'll have some feed. We'll have an interesting event that you all can participate in, and have an outstanding evening. Go outside and vote, and we'll hope to see you guys in about 2 months. Thank you very much.